Catherine Dunne, thank you very much for giving us some time here at your Harlow. I came across your book, An Unconsidered People, the Irish in London, in 2002, and now it's been republished. There's a very strong Harlow connection in this book. So can you tell me a little bit how the book came about and the Harlow connection?
Okay, well, I think one of the reasons it came about was I actually met a woman on a boat between what was then the former Yugoslavia and Venice. This is going back into the 1980s. And the whole topic of emigration had always interested me. I watched my mother's absolute heartbreak when my eldest brother left, for example. And I couldn't understand it. You know, he was only going to somewhere really exciting like London, and we were stuck in Dublin. I couldn't understand what the grief was all about. But obviously, as I got a bit older, I began to understand a little bit more. And so he used to tell us stories of what, now he was becoming a professional man. You know, he was very lucky. He had a good start. He had family there, as so many other Irish people did. But this woman that I met on the boat, we just struck up a conversation. And she had left Mooncoin in County Kilkenny when she was 17, through all sorts of very difficult family circumstances. Now, about 10 years before my brother. So we're into the 50s now at this stage. And she left Mooncoin because there was nothing for her at home. There was no work. Her mother had died. Her father couldn't keep the family together. And she had an older sister already in London. So she left. And when we were talking for that entire journey, I was fascinated by what she was discussing, what she was remembering was, to me, an Ireland that had never existed, or if it did, I had never known it. Because it was an Ireland that was mythologized through her memory. And when we began to go through our interview, and it became very clear what the really difficult conditions were, this was later on, the difficult conditions were that she'd moved from, I was even more astonished that the memory that she had was of all things that were good and wholesome and better and family orientated and all the rest of it. So sometime after that conversation, I went to see her in London because we became friends. And she brought me to a club on the Edgware Road. And I met lots and lots and lots of other Irish, a lot of them from Mayo, actually. And one of the things which struck me there was the fact that the Mehel was still alive and well, because one person at home had lost a child and they were in poor circumstances. So the entire community rallied around, did a fundraiser, sent the money home for the funeral and to look after the family. So more and more I became drawn into these three Irelands, if you like, the one that I knew, the one that these people had grown up in, and then the one that still lived on in their imagination. So I was talking to a publisher about it one day, and he said to me, I want a book out of that. And I'd already been thinking along those lines myself, but it's something you have to proceed with very, very carefully. And you'll know because you interview people. There's a lot about people's inner lives, which is very interesting for the reader, but maybe just a little bit too intrusive for the individual to talk about. So I decided what I needed to do was I needed to come back to London. And I started off with a list of people given to me by this woman, Phyllis. She's the first interviewee in the book. And thank goodness she's also still with us, like Tony from Harlow. Mm-hmm. And she gave me a list of names of people that I could interview or even just have a conversation with. And that, then the tentacles would spread out and maybe we might be able to find other people who would have interesting stories. I mean, to me, they were all interesting stories. I think I probably either had long conversations with or interviewed maybe about 200 people. And the 10 which I chose for the book were, for me, the most representative stories, of what I was looking for. So one of those connections, and to be honest, at this stage, I can't remember which one it was, sent me to Harlow. I think I might mention in the book where the connection came from. And one of my first interviewees was Tony Marr. And at that stage, I mean, that's going back well over 20 years now. So, I mean, Harlow was still relatively new. It was a town that was growing up. And there were a lot of Irish there. There were a huge amount of Irish there. And I think maybe Your dad was one. Tony Maher was another. There may have been others whose stories didn't appear in the book, but what came across to me from the interviews and all the conversations that I had was the threads of similarity between the experience. And I suppose I would have gone with some of my own agenda. Everybody does. We're not tabula rasa. You go with your own agenda. And I'd heard a lot about Irish people being discriminated against. I'd heard a lot about, uneasy neighbours and all that sort of stuff. So that was always in the back of my mind. And if it became a question, if it arose in the conversation, I would ask it. But most of the time, for my first visits, I just listened. I took notes, but I listened. I didn't ask any questions. And what came up again and again was one of the major differences that these Irish people that I interviewed were so grateful for, that if you did your job and you were competent at what you did and you didn't make any trouble, then the foreman didn't care where you came from. And yet a lot had experienced a kind of, I think it was Tony Maher who called it tuppence halfpenny looking down on tuppence, where if they're working in Ireland, where there was a hierarchy which, we like to pretend sometimes doesn't exist, or a hierarchy which is a little bit less visible maybe than the social class structure in Britain, but nonetheless, it's here. So that was one thing which they found very refreshing. And also the fact that towns like Harlow were a new start in every sense. New town, new place. You could leave your past behind you in many ways. You could leave, well, you certainly left poverty behind you, but you might be able to leave a lot of the old attitudes behind you as well. Because again, and this is something which Tony would have said, and I have not reread the book. These are memories from all those years ago. Tony would have said to me that he believed that the Irish were one of the worst at pulling the ladder up after them. That once they arrived somewhere and were settled, they often weren't the best at helping out those who followed. So this was wonderful material for me, because we're getting under the surface of the mythology, that came with this silly notion that all of the Irish who emigrated went for the same reasons. Many did not. And one of the things which emerged, and then I discovered afterwards from reading academic books, was that in fact women emigrated from this country in much greater numbers than men during those really dark and dismal economic years. And for many of them, it was a case of looking over their shoulders at their mothers and their grandmothers' lives in rural Ireland and saying, this isn't for me. So it was a kind of interview that grew organically, that after I'd spoken to one person, they'd say to me, I think you really need to speak to X because they have a really interesting story. And something which we alluded to earlier before our interview started, you were talking about the way that your brother, God rest him, had been very, very connected to Ireland, and you not so much so until you grew older. And I found that a really interesting pattern repeating itself in second generation Irish, where some of the children would identify very, very strongly with Ireland, and others in the family very, very strongly with England, and didn't want the Irish connection. They wanted to carve their own identity. They wanted to be their own person. So there were a lot of threads, no matter where I interviewed people and where they came from, where all of these similarities began to emerge. And so when women went, yes, they went for economic reasons, but they also went for adventure. And they went for the kind of freedom that they would never have had in Ireland. And there is one very funny story, which I won't spoil, but in the first interview with Phyllis, where she talks about herself and her husband to be going into a chemist the day before they get married, and neither of them is able to ask for what they need. And of course, at that stage in Ireland, contraception just was not even on the radar. So there were many different reasons why people went, but I suppose they were my three starting points. What was the Ireland they remember? What is their new experience in the home where they are now? And then also to look at how they might feel about coming back to that mythological Ireland after they retired. And that was a really interesting discussion. It almost divided along gender lines almost completely. where, you know, if you've been in a new country, a new town like Harlow, or an old town like Kilburn or Cricklewood, well settled, but if you'd been there for maybe 30 years if you're married and you had children and grandchildren, women, mothers and grandmothers did not want to leave that. They didn't want to break that tie. They wanted to stay, no matter how imperfect, but they wanted to stay with that connection. And men were often the people who wanted to come home, still home. And that was another duality, which I always found very interesting. That sense of identity as people settled, where the identity was, I'm Birmingham Irish, I'm Coventry Irish, I'm London Irish, so the two together. And then the other duality of home. That, and it was Phyllis again who made that distinction for me, that she had a heart home, which was Ireland, and she had a maid home, which was in England. And I thought that distinction was very interesting. So a lot of the men who did come home, come back to Ireland after they retired, the experience was not universally a good one, because the type of welcome which one gets coming home on holidays with pockets stuffed full of money and everybody knowing that you're going back after 2 weeks is a very different experience from the one where you might return from London, maybe with more money in your pocket than the community in which you were settling, and you're buying a house or land or something which other people possibly can't afford. So good old Irish begrudgery often comes into the equation. Stop me at any stage, Michael, if you want to clarify anything or jump in.
The thing that I thought, as I said, I hadn't read the book in 20 years, and it was only yesterday I was interviewing Tony Maha. So a couple of things is, so there's two things, is that when my father said he'd go back on, and Tony's interview was part of, you know, talking about his life in Ireland for 18 years and then coming. But the idea of you go home on holiday and the first thing people say is, when you're going back. And I thought that was just something funny, but it wasn't necessarily funny, was it? No,
not really, because again, the sense was, you know, you're grand where you are, you're not coming back home here to take our job. So it was, and I'm very happy to be in the pub and drinking and, you know, taking the hospitality of the returning emigrant. And, you know, in many ways, and again, I used to feel this even with my own brother, that they were almost obliged to come and spend their 2 weeks a year back at home with old family and old friends. When, you know, there's a whole big world out there to be explored. And yes, you want to maintain your connection with home. But this became almost something expected, that you were letting the side down if you didn't do this. And that was a very, you know, that was a very tricky thing to try to navigate. That you would, a role was expected, and Tom Murphy has written plays about this. You know, a role was expected of you when you came home, where you would be the hail fellow well met at the bar. You know, you would spend, and most of them spent 50 weeks trying to get the money together to go back, to do this for 2 weeks and then come back to digs and start the whole process all over again.
But Tony's experience, as I said, I'm doing 75 interviews from Afghanistan and Zimbabwe about people's lives in their country before they came to Harlem. And Tony's interview was very much, it was, you know, a man who's now nearly 85 years of age, but he just turned this village outside Kildare. There's nothing here. Simple as that, wasn't it? A simple economic decision in many ways. There's nothing here.
Nothing. No.
I could do all my island interviews. I'll probably do 3 or 4. It may be, if I do people of a certain age, that will be it, won't it?
I think it will. I mean, rural Ireland was a wasteland, you know, in the late 1940s and 50s. And post-war reconstruction in Britain just seemed like a dream. There's a wonderful book by an Irish writer called Ultan Cowley, called The Men Who Built Britain. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a wonderful book, looking at the navvies, the experience of being the navvy and what that was like in London. I mean, like well over 1 million people left this country in the 1950s. We can't actually, it isn't documented the precise amount, but we know that it's well over 1 million. And we also know that the money which was sent back, I think we were one of very few countries which had emigrant remittances as part of our income as a country. But of course, that only caught the tip of the iceberg, because the way in which 10 shilling notes and pound notes came home, or £5 notes, they came home in birthday cards and wrapped up in newspapers. or sent home with other people who were going to visit the village. I mean, the reason I gave the book An Unconsidered People, but the reason I gave it that title was because I really still do not believe, although it's changing a little bit now, that we give enough acknowledgement and enough gratitude and appreciation to that generation for everything they did for this country in their absence. If I am remembering my figure correctly, and it doesn't matter if I'm wrong because the punchline is the same, if you like, the value of the emigrant remittances that were recorded in this country, which means the official ones that we could track in 1961, was something like £23 million. Now, that's what we could track. That was the official stuff. You and I know that there were swathes more money that came through different circumstances. The entire education budget for this state in 1961 was that exact amount. So to me, they educated a generation. I'm just going to check to make sure that I'm absolutely right. It's you'll see it for yourself. It's in the back of the book where I quote that figure. So, you know, their contribution was extraordinary. First of all, they were, and it's a dreadful thing to call them this, but that's how they were known. They were a safety valve. Because without that safety valve in the 1950s, it's quite likely this country would have seen a great deal of unrest. The poverty was grinding, and Joe Lee writes about this in his history book, you know, that they were a safety valve. Once they left, the pressure released a little because they were going and sending money home. And I remember one of my interviewees from Mayo spoke to me about, as a child, as a young boy, as a 14-year-old, I met him as part of a Mayo emigrant group. He wasn't an immigrant himself at that point. But he remembers as a young boy of 13 or 14, he got a job cycling around the village on a Saturday morning. And his job was to deliver the money orders that came from Britain to the impoverished households. Mayo, the phrase Mayo, God help us.
I'm just aware we still have a Facebook page called Harlow Irish, and these are second, third, maybe even fourth generation. And is it good to see, the people who interviewed, the surnames acknowledged in the book, Howe, Ruane, Dunne, Kelleher. Is it good to see that Irish communities are still together, still cohesive here in England?
Yeah, I mean, everybody, as you discovered yourself when you grew older, everybody has a need to know where they come from. And that's one of the problems at the moment, for example, with all of the awfulness here with the mother and baby homes, where there are so many missing children and illegally adopted children who grow up in England or somewhere in America not knowing who they are. So there's a fundamental human need to know who we are and where we come from. So that's, yes, I mean, coming together as an Irish community is very good. I wouldn't like to see it as being only exclusive, because I think when you make your life in a new country, I think it's good to be able to straddle those two communities and be part of each, because sometimes small communities can become isolated. It's great to have them there for support, but it's perhaps not so good to restrict yourself only maybe to one world view. I think it's better to broaden out your friendship base a little bit more.